So we've got this down for those who couldn't make it. We had a number of people who wanted to attend and couldn't. My name's Mark Winfield. I'm a professor of environmental studies at York University, and I'm also co-chair of the Sustainable Energy Initiative at the university. And I want to welcome you to the first of what may be a series of webinars on behalf of SEI. We don't know how long we're going to be in this space. Usually we do these as a mixture of live and webcast events. Obviously the live part is not on for now. We're still in the process of working out a few technical aspects. Welcome to my basement. I've not been able to make the virtual background work. We had plans of appearing to be in Cancun, but the technology was not going to cooperate with all of that. I've muted everybody so far, and I'm going to ask people to stay muted just because, particularly with a large group like this, there are possibilities of feedback in the Zoom system. We've been learning about that part of it as well as we go. The way I'm going to proceed here is to do a presentation on our Unlocking the Climate Potential of Energy Efficiency report, and then we will when I'm doing that, I'm going to switch into a screen share, so limited view of my basement. I'm going to suggest people hold questions until the end of the presentation. I'm planning on taking maybe 30 or 40 minutes to do that, because I know people's Zoom tolerance is, we're in a large social experiment here, and to see how long people can handle this. At that stage, we'll go into a question and answer function, and you should be able to see there should be somewhere on your screen a list of participants, and with that, for some reason, Zoom is not letting me make the raise hand function work, but there is a yes function, which if we were doing votes, we're not. But I'll treat the yes as a raised hand for question purposes. And so we'll see where we're at once we're at that stage and see how many questions there are. So we had planned to do something like this around the energy efficiency study, and we paused that plan in light of the current situation, but then decided to proceed in this format, partially because it needed to be done, partially we had a sense that people may have a willingness or an interest in talking about something other than you know what, or more recent events. And also, we need to keep these conversations going, that there are discussions going on about what happens as we come out of this situation and what does reconstruction look like. And this is one of the themes that we'd want to make sure are in those conversations going forward. We can sort of think of this as keeping the policy stream alive, or keeping the niches alive if you're into socio-technical transitions theory. But this is a fairly essential function. We know that coming out of previous events like this, they've actually been very, very creative periods in history. Here in Ontario, if you look back, the 1946 to 1949 period, the immediate post-war period, is actually a remarkably productive period in environmental policy. It's when the Conservation Authorities Act was enacted, the 1946, the Planning Act as well, various things set in motion around forestry, water, pollution. So we want to be sort of engaging in these sort of thinking about how do we move forward. And from there, I'm going to go into a screen share and walk our way through the presentation, and then we'll take questions at the end. And hopefully, it looks like everybody's audio is working. I'm not seeing things in the chat traffic suggesting otherwise, so I think we're good to go. So I'm going to go to a screen share. So you'll see less of me in my basement and more of our presentation. So here we go. And into Yeah. There we go. And I may need to minimize that. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the report that was released in February by the Sustainable Energy Initiative on energy efficiency governance, so specifically on oops, so working, come on, unlocking the climate potential of energy efficiency. And this was a sort of national report, although I'm going to be talking today more about the Ontario-specific implications of our findings. We have a few people to thank around this, particularly the George Cedric Metcalf Foundation, which was the primary funder of the report. The ECHO Foundation also contributed. And then we also had contributions from the Ontario Climate Consortium through the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, Efficiency Canada, particularly in the form of Brendan Hawley's expertise and nationwide perspective, and then our own Faculty of Environmental Studies here at York University, or not here at York University at the moment. Project team consisted of myself and Peter Love, who is an adjunct professor at the faculty and was project co-director. In some ways, this was very much Peter's idea. James Gotti, who is a postdoctoral fellow at University of Waterloo, was the principal investigator. Scott Harbinson, who's one of our recent Master of Environmental Studies graduates, did a lot of the spade work in terms of digging up the case studies and the details, which we'll talk about further on. And as I mentioned, Brendan acted as a project advisor. The project came from a number of different sources, partially a recognition of the potentially large contribution of energy efficiency measures to meeting the Pan-Canadian framework and Paris targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We have a number of sort of modeling exercises and potential studies out there, including ones from the IEA and NRCan, suggesting very significant potential contributions. Potentially a very highly cost-effective strategy as well. We know in general the cost-effectiveness of well-designed efficiency measures tends to be extremely high. There's a tendency for there to potentially very strong mutually reinforcing gains and relatively few adverse trade-offs. In some ways, this stage of things started now more than a decade ago when we were working on the integrated power system plan that the Ontario Power Authority produced, and I was part of a sustainability assessment of the plan and various elements of it. And one of the things that we noted coming out of that was that the efficiency pathway was the one that offered the least adverse trade-offs and lowest risk. At least one wanted to maximize the opportunities there before moving into more supply-oriented options. We're also aware in the energy efficiency world that we've been seeing the emergence of new governance models, especially agencies for the specific purpose of designing and delivering energy efficiency strategies. Efficiency One in in Nova Scotia, in Energy Efficiency Alberta that was created by the Notley government, but is actually seems to be surviving. Jason Kenney, Transitions Énergétiques Québec, which is a Crown corporation in Quebec that was created in 2017 for the specific purpose of implementing a low carbon transition strategy in Quebec. And full disclosure, I am a member of the Conseil d'Administration de TEC. So that has informed somewhat our thinking in terms of way forward as well. We're also aware that this was a situation in which, at least at one point and in some jurisdictions, new revenue sources were coming into the picture, particularly through carbon pricing, and that again seemed to potentially sort of shift the dynamics here. This is just one of the sort of modeling exercises out there. This is the IEA NRCan work that was suggesting that efficiency measures, achievable efficiency measures, could account for 30 to 40% of the required greenhouse gas reductions needed to meet the PCF and Paris targets. At the same time, we recognized the landscape around this was becoming much more complicated politically, that we were actually seeing energy efficiency strategies and measures becoming targets for retrenchment and even elimination at the subnational level, both the United States and Canada. What happened here in Ontario in March 2019 with the basic termination of the conservation first framework on the electricity side was dramatic, but not that unusual or unique in this experience. And given that efficiency presents as a relatively highly cost-effective, low trade-off strategy, in theory, should be relatively resilient, a relatively resilient component of low carbon transition strategies, we felt we needed to understand what the nature of the drivers behind these retrenchments were, which were quite widespread, as we'll see, and then to develop principles around resiliency as well as effectiveness in energy efficiency governance design. So we're very focused on the governance questions. We did not necessarily get deeply into issues of program and portfolio design. We want to deal with these sort of higher level challenges that were emerging. The specific case studies that we looked at 3 US ones, Connecticut, Maine, and Indiana, and 6 in Canada in detail in the main report, Ontario, Alberta, British Columbia, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. The defining feature of all of these cases was that there had been some form of major disruption around energy efficiency strategies in the last few years, and they gave us a window into how the dynamics of these events were happening. There is one other case study, which I've hinted at already, kind of informed our thinking a great deal, which was Quebec. And we didn't deal with that directly in the main report. There is a parallel paper that I sent the link around to that Brendan was the lead on in energy research and social science, which looked more specifically at tech. And I'll probably send a link around to the tech plan director as well, because it did influence our thinking, but it is also subject to one of these existential crises. There is legislation before the Assemblée Nationale, which would essentially abolish tech and some associated organizations around the government's climate change strategy. We don't know how that's going to come out, but it did present yet another example of these sorts of disruptions that we've been trying to understand the drivers of. And this is very important in the context of low carbon transitions, where relative stability is very, very important in terms of achievement of long-term goals. The nature of the shocks varied from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. In some cases, these were resource constraints. In some cases, disagreements among stakeholders. But for the most part, what we were dealing with were relatively high-level political interventions, usually associated with changes in government, sometimes in the context of some economic distress. And indeed, in many cases, the immediate driver is a focus on relatively short-term or more immediate sort of electricity or energy costs, and a desire to remove anything that can be taken off the bill from the bill. And efficiency in that context was identified in some places as a high-order target. In some cases, there were more complex political stories at work. We've sort of laid all of those out. But our challenge was really thinking about, well, how do you then get to resiliency in the face of these sorts of events? At the same time, you do want to maintain some degree of flexibility and responsiveness. You don't want to ossify the system. What you want is to be able to continue to focus on the long-term goals around decarbonization and what sorts of features will get you there. In thinking about this, we had a fairly detailed look at the public policy literature around policy resiliency, and that goes back some time. And from that, plus our case studies, began thinking about, well, what would principles for resilient and effective energy efficiency governance look like? And we had to look at this through a national perspective. We were not looking at specific provinces, although, as I'll say in the second half here, I'm going to talk specifically about what do these principles look like if you apply them specifically to Ontario. But that analysis needs to be jurisdictionally specific in terms of what this might mean in the particular circumstances. And that thinking was partially driven by the fact that we knew that we had quite different institutional arrangements yet present in different provinces. Some, like Ontario, relatively polycentric with lots of actors involved. In other places like Alberta, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, much more centralized models. And we have to think about what does that mean in those contexts. But the 5 principles that we identified are presented here. That they are somewhat generic, but also of some use here, that there need to be clarity about what the objectives of energy efficiency strategies are, what problems are we trying to solve, and sometimes that came up in the challenges, why do these strategies exist at all? There needs to be clarity about roles and responsibilities. There needs to be clarity around funding mechanisms. There needs to be elements of fairness in terms of distribution of costs and benefits. That doesn't mean a strict approach, but one that is perceived to be fair and reasonable. That implies a certain degree of participation on the part of the actors in the formulation of strategies. There needs to be flexibility in terms of precisely the ability to respond to changing circumstances and demands, also to be able to take advantage of emerging opportunities. We had a lot of discussion around the role of polycentrism, that is to say, engagement of multiple actors in the design and delivery of programs. And the theory is that more polycentric systems should be more resilient in the sense that you have multiple actors involved, multiple centers of power, and also potentially more creative. It can play in different ways. We've seen a certain degree of robustness among relatively centralized systems in places like New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and Alberta up to this point as well. And on the other hand, Ontario's system, which was relatively polycentric with LDCs, Enbridge, IESO, third parties, all involved, in some ways proved to be fragile. I mean, a large piece of it was removed by a ministerial directive, although other parts of the system have survived, on the gas side, for example. So this one is relatively jurisdiction specific and requires thinking through what does that mean in this case. And as we'll see, there's also potentially significant trade-offs in terms of program integration and coordination in relatively polycentric systems versus relatively centralized ones. And again, this is one of the tensions we had to deal with in thinking about this in an Ontario context, is dealing with the need for coordination and integration on one hand, but not wanting to necessarily undo the polycentric aspects of the system, the fact that you had actors out there with quite a lot of experience and success in this space in delivery of efficiency programming that we did not want to cut out of the picture or displace. Diversity in terms of approaches, tools, crucially around funding models as well, emerges as a very significant factor. In terms of applying this, so we sort of had this set of principles which are sort of somewhat abstract at this stage, and which then needed to sort of make them more concrete, needed to be applied at the level of a specific jurisdiction around, well, what does this translate into in terms of what do you do? In Ontario, we sort of focused on this as our case study, our guinea pig, for a number of reasons. One being simply we were relatively familiar with this case. We also had, putting the best face on it, the advantage of the termination of the Conservation First framework in March of last year, which essentially left a blank slate, tabula rasa kind of situation in terms of designing things partially from the ground up. Obviously, the gas side of things had continued and is regarded as relatively successful, mostly thought of in terms of how do we push much further into that space. At the same time, we were conscious that through various reviews of the system, there are very clear messages about the need for greater coordination and integration. And that creates some interesting tensions because, of course, we've had this somewhat unusual situation of two quite separate pathways, one around natural gas and the other around electricity, which only cross over occasionally, and we have no real institutional structures for achieving that. So we're sort of trying to figure out how do you maintain, or how do you deal with the fragmentation problems, the need for greater coordination and integration on one hand, and at the same time retain some of the advantages of the relatively polycentric and relatively effective delivery models that we've had in the province in the past. We're aware the funding model remains a very significant challenge with the demise of the cap and trade system, and more importantly, the revenues that were going to flow from it, because there were, of course, substantial revenues that were to flow into the building sector, which in Ontario makes a lot of sense in terms of where greenhouse gas emissions come from and where there are significant opportunities for improvements. And that question remains sort of on the table. In terms of the key challenges we're facing, in fact, what problems are we trying to solve here? There's really a list of things that we had in mind. Obviously, progress on climate change and low carbon transitions is fairly central. And as I mentioned, the building sector in particular is a very significant source of emissions, potentially significant source of growth. So this is a very logical target. We didn't deal with the transportation side in this particular exercise, given the complexities there. There's another research project which is dealing with that. Clearly, controlling long-term energy costs is a factor. There's clearly political sensitivities around that, so that becomes a very important consideration too, is how does this help us keep energy costs reasonably low from a consumer perspective? There are potentially advantages in terms of energy system efficiency and resiliency. We were conscious of the desire for much better consumer level integration of efficiency services, that there be kind of a one window form of delivery from a consumer perspective. And then there were a couple of other sort of landscape level complications that we had in mind in the background. One is the relative absence in Ontario at the moment of any real long-term planning framework around energy and electricity. Classically, one seeks to integrate energy efficiency considerations into some form of integrated resource planning exercise, and then that goes in front of a regulator, and where the extent to which the efficiency components are being optimized is tested. And of course, we don't have that anymore. We never really did. And the long-term energy plans, although they exist, are fundamentally political documents. I mean, they're not subject to any sort of external review. So part of our thinking here was also, well, if there isn't an overall energy planning framework, perhaps it makes sense to start with an energy efficiency planning framework first and work from there. Sort of turn the situation on its head a bit. There are other factors we had in mind too, particularly around the emergence of distributed energy resources. And we've also, through other research projects, been in a lot of conversations with municipalities and municipal staff who are engaged in community level energy and climate change planning. And in the course of those conversations, energy efficiency questions, especially around buildings, tend to come up very, very strongly. So we wanted to think about, well, how can we be enabling of those sorts of activities as well? What we wanted to achieve in terms of goals is the pursuit of all technically feasible, achievable, and cost-effective on a full avoided cost basis, and that includes environmental and social costs, efficiency improvements across fuel types, and to make sure that there's a loading order kind of approach to that happens before the development or refurbishment of energy supplies. And we're looking for ways to build that into the system. As I mentioned, the focus for us was very much on buildings and equipment. At a sort of high level, you could apply the same governance principles to transportation, which of course is the other area where we see potential significant growth in emissions in Ontario. But we treated that as sort of outside of the scope of this particular study just because of the complications in that landscape. There have been attempts to do that. I mean, if you look at the tech plan directeur, it does deal with transportation somewhat, although mostly around electrification, although there are other interesting elements in there. But at least on this path, we thought it made sense to look at the gas and electricity components, particularly in relation to buildings and equipment. The core proposal that we've made here is around the idea of creating a new provincial agency, Energy Efficiency Ontario, and to give it a mandate to develop a comprehensive integrated energy plan, efficiency strategy for the province. So the thinking, to be very direct, was to a certain element of, well, if you took Transitions Energy to Quebec and particularly its master plan for energy, which is called a plan directeur, and you did this in Ontario, what would that look like? And one of the considerations, as I mentioned, we have to take into account, which is quite different from Quebec and other places, is that we're not starting from a blank slate. We already have established actors in the energy efficiency space. We already have this degree of polycentricity. So how do we, on the one hand, improve the degree of integration and coordination while retaining those polycentric aspects of the system and the engagement of the actors around them? So the primary functions here of Energy Efficiency Ontario are around strategy and coordination as opposed to program delivery. We wanted to see Energy Efficiency Ontario develop a provincial energy efficiency strategy similar to the tech plan directeur, and you can look at the tech plan. I'll send the links around later so you can get a sense of its scope, which is very comprehensive. We need a plan that outlines targets, roles, and functions for all of the different key actors in the process: utilities, provincial agencies, municipalities. Again, this draws from the tech plan directeur experience, where the plan was subject to cabinet approval ultimately. And that does have certain advantages in the sense that it makes it binding on provincial agencies once you've got the plan in place. And so it does become an across-government enterprise. There's a very clear pathway forward. Some would argue it's perhaps excessively top-down, and this is one of the things we were trying to balance off. Although even it has certain bottom-up aspects, the plan was in some ways assembled from elements that existed as well as new elements. We would envision these strategies be subject to a renewal cycle of certainly not more than 5 years, and with them, energy efficiency potential study, renewed energy efficiency potential studies as well, because again, we know technology is changing, economic structure is changing, the nature of the opportunities and the needs are shifting, and we need to be responding to that and sensitive to that. We also envisioned Energy Efficiency in Ontario engaged in reviews of energy efficiency standards and codes, ideally on a 3-year cycle. Again, this continuation in some ways of existing policy, although perhaps sort of strengthening it a bit, to continue to benchmark and keep pace with the leaders in North America on standards and codes. We envision that the agency would participate in OEB hearings. It would be a party to assist in evaluating the energy efficiency components of LDC, Enbridge, and IESO plans and programs. And there would be mechanisms to provide support to LDCs and potentially Enbridge as needed in energy efficiency program and design and delivery, particularly smaller LDCs with lower capacity. We did not envision Energy Efficiency Ontario necessarily as being the primary deliverer of services, except in certain circumstances where it's appropriate. We were very much wanting to bring the LDCs back into the energy efficiency conversation. And we know Enbridge's presence has continued and is very active and very effective in as much as they've done. It needs to go much further. But again, one does not want to walk away from that history. And other finer grained functions we had in mind, data access and modeling support for energy efficiency program design would be very useful. This is also a message that we've heard very strongly from municipal partners around community and climate change energy planning, has been that they're desperate for data and modeling capacity, especially around efficiency and other dimensions of things. So some supports there will be very useful. There are arrangements in British Columbia, for example, to do precisely this, but seem to be very much absent in Ontario. We did think about this in terms of what sort of longer term, bigger picture energy planning or electricity or climate change planning processes there might be. And we certainly envisioned Energy Efficiency Ontario being part of that. We don't know what they are at the moment, but our experience tells us that you would very much want an advocate for a voice for efficiency in those processes, indeed possibly within the institutions charged with carrying out these functions as well. There needs to be an annual reporting and evaluation function. Some of this is some aspects that were in the Environmental Commissioner's Office, although we would see Energy Efficiency Ontario reporting out on its own, and then in further oversight function on the part of the Auditor General ECO office as well, and I'll come back to that in a second. As I mentioned, one of the things we wanted to do was to think about this in terms of the relative polycentricity of the existing system, and that meant that you want to involve multiple agents in design and implementation. That seemed less where we had problems in the first place. It's really around the coordination and integration element. So we did envision wanting to bring the LDCs back into the picture, particularly for residential and small and medium commercial consumers. Enbridge obviously needs to continue what it's doing for its customer base and expand that significantly. The IESO might well continue to deal directly with large industrial consumers. One of the things we were particularly interested in from a residential and small commercial consumer perspective was the potential role of third-party service providers. And this idea came partially from my learnings from the low-income energy network and some very interesting things there, especially in the low-income programming, where you've seen third-party service providers. In that case, it's principally Greensaver was the one we heard a presentation about, which has emerged effectively as the sort of one-window delivery agent for energy efficiency services on both the gas and electricity side. So that from a consumer perspective, they're just dealing with one agent, and the sort of questions of what's IESO versus what's Enbridge is worked out behind the scenes where the customer does not need to see it. So we saw some potential roles there going forward in terms of how would you make that work on a larger scale. Clearly, municipal affairs has to continues to hold the legal pen on building code, but with I think strengthened input and analysis from Energy Efficiency Ontario. The same thing on efficiency codes and standards and Ministry of Energy. On the municipal side, again, this has come out of our community energy planning work. One of the things we thought it would be useful to do, and indeed we heard a great deal about this, is that where municipalities have developed community energy or climate change plans, that they should be able to go further than what's in the building code. This would be something like the BC step code model, where the provincial standards sort of function as a floor, and if municipalities have capacity and interest to go further than that, then they have the space to do that. Funding remains a problem until the question of carbon pricing somehow gets resolved. We've had various discussions within the research team. I think where we've landed in large part is that the sort of tax-based model, which in theory is what exists in Ontario, is simply too fragile to meet the test of resiliency. It's too vulnerable to completely exogenous factors in terms of what's happening with overall government budgets and deficits, and so can be subject to fiscal pressures for no reason related to energy efficiency portfolios at all. That some form of dedicated revenue streams seem to make more sense. Indeed, that's the more or less standard model, that program delivery can be working on a cost recovery based cost effectiveness tests off the electricity and gas rate base. And indeed, we also considered there can be a mixture. One possibility is also that you do a straight flat rate kind of approach as well for certain components. Again, TEQ is informative where there is a very significant revenue stream called the CAPA, which is essentially a percentage rider on gas and Hydro-Quebec rates, which generates close to $50 million a year for tech. The rest of the funds come out of, at least up until now, have come from the Fonds Vert, which is essentially the carbon fund, the carbon trading revenue stream. Hopefully, in the longer term, the carbon pricing issues between the province and the federal government will get resolved. I mean, there is a substantial bundle of federal money out there, supposedly earmarked for Ontario already, in addition to whatever revenues may come from carbon pricing. The critical question there remains, and it remains in other provinces as well, is the need to make sure that whatever revenues come out of carbon pricing actually are invested well in terms of cost-effective low-carbon transitions. In Ontario, we never fully got there before everything was dismantled. Even in Quebec, there are some challenges around the Fonds Vert and its role, which in some ways represented something of a gold standard in terms of trying to make sure that revenues were going into cost-effective low-carbon transition investment. So there's still complications there in terms of what one might be able to do. We did also look at this through a lens of continuous improvement. We did put in a suggestion that we take the California model of requiring when utilities are coming forward with their rate and their capital investment plans that they need to demonstrate their pursuit of all cost-effective and achievable energy efficiency opportunities, effectively the loading order approach, and that be one of the conditions of approval by the OEB. We've built in recommendations for regular updates on potential studies, plans, and standards and codes. This is not a static exercise. It needs to move forward. And then we also emphasized in a couple of places in the recommendations the need for portfolios to address the needs of marginalized constituencies. That needs to happen both at the level of Energy Efficiency Ontario's overall plan or strategy, but it also needs to be seen in the energy efficiency strategies that you see at a sort of local level from the LDCs and from Enbridge to make sure that those constituencies are being considered. And that may be a relatively location-specific set of considerations in terms of what specific needs and gaps might exist in specific areas. The OEB would play a role in oversight of utility rate cases in terms of making sure that we're seeing pursuit of efficiency opportunities as things are moved in front of the board with technical support from Energy Efficiency Ontario. And then we've also recommended strengthening the mandate around the Auditor General, Environmental Commissioner. And in effect here, what happened when the commissioner was merged into the Auditor General's office was that the specific reporting mandate around energy efficiency effectively was lost. And all of the reporting now, of course, is bundled into the one Auditor General report per year, which is very comprehensive, but in many ways overwhelming. One of the things we've recommended is that those reporting functions on the part of what used to be ECO, still is, be broken back out into a distinct reporting window. That's quite important, we think, in terms of raising the profile of efficiency issues, sort of having the continuous sort of automatic stabilizer effect of ongoing reporting happening so that agencies are aware of that, the media is aware of that, governments are aware of that. That's always going to be a present part of the conversation. So that's kind of my opening pitch, as it were. Say we will post this, and we'll post the slide deck on the SEI website. Any questions can come to me as well afterwards. But that's sort of our sort of first pass at what this might look like going forward in Ontario. And at this stage, I think I'm going to stop the screen share, and that lets us move into more of the question and answer sort of mode. So if people do have questions, the best approach to this, I think, is going to be to use the raise hand or the vote yes function that should be available to you, and then I can unmute people as necessary, and we can do the question and answer part. And say I'm happy to take questions afterwards as well by email as people sort of digest all of this going forward. So I'm seeing one question from Kevin Devitt, so we could go there first and then see if more questions emerge.
Hi, Mark. No, I was just letting you know that the raise hand function does work on the bot. So that was my comment at the beginning.
Okay, very good.
No question.
Excellent. So we know that is actually functioning. That's great. Other questions?
Mark, there's a question from Ralph in the chat box.
Ah, okay, thank you. It's a good question from Ralph, and we've sort of struggled with this one a bit. Is how much are you, how much do you rely on the sort of what's cost effective in terms of efficiency opportunities versus a more target-based kind of approach? And I have to admit that within the research team, we went back and forth on this a bit. Part of this is that we had some experience with imposing targets, and those do need to flow from potential studies in terms of what do we think is actually achievable and reasonable to put out there. And at the same time, yes, there is a risk around the cost effectiveness element that you may get people gaming the system and arguing that what's achievable is relatively low. On the other hand, we thought, you know, there is also a need to get some degree of buy-in from the various actors in terms of what they think is feasible and what they're prepared to buy into doing. There may need to be some pushing there. And we were also sort of conscious in building the Energy Efficiency Ontario role into the OEB process, that there would be some high capacity potential to push back in terms of what was being conceived of and argued falls within the realm of cost effectiveness. We also did think about that in terms of making sure how we're considering avoided costs and things like that takes a broad perspective on this, including avoided carbon and other environmental costs and social benefits. So that was the way we were trying to deal with that. So that's our answer to that one. So the next one, I'll deal with some through chat and some through raised hands. The next one from Rajiv. The problem really around, and the question here is around, do you need a new entity when you've got IESO involved in some way and Enbridge working on gas? And I think our answer here was basically yes. because of the complications and the lack of integration between the two sides, has very consistently come up as a question around this. That on the one hand, there's useful bottom-up elements to this, and clearly Enbridge has done very well in terms of what it's done. Perhaps needs to be much more ambitious going forward in terms of what we need to achieve in terms of low carbon transitions. But it seemed to us that the system is left with some fairly significant gaps in terms of overall coordination and integration. IESO can't really do that, given at the moment it doesn't have much of a mandate at all, other than to continue some low income and industrial programs. But at the same time, it is fundamentally associated with the electricity side of this story. And so its ability to sort of coordinate on the gas side and to facilitate the integration there seemed to us potentially a challenge. And that was sort of our thinking in terms of, well, why would you create a new institutional entity? The other factor, of course, is IESO has a larger purview, and the intention here is to have an agency with a very, very clear focus on optimizing the efficiency potential and maximizing it as we go forward. So from that perspective, we thought this is where you could achieve a more comprehensive mandate and facilitate the development of a strategy which is much more inclusive across the board. Essentially, to say we're strongly informed in our thinking about the plan directeur from Quebec, which achieves that and does seem to have moved forward fairly successfully. You know, to acknowledge there are all kinds of cultural and institutional factors at work there as well. But it did seem to get us where we needed to be. If we're really looking to optimize our efficiency contributions from a low carbon transitions perspective, then we're going to need that level of focus and integration and ambition to try and move that forward. So that was part of our thinking there in terms of why we would want a new entity to move all this forward. So a couple of questions just coming through here, more in the chat.
Sorry, I accidentally just sent all kinds of gibberish to the chat.
Okay.
What I was trying to say was this question, which I will say verbally,
Yep.
and I apologize to the group for the gibberish. So it's to follow up on Ralph's question. Is there potential for this organization to support local municipalities that are more ambitious in setting their targets? That is, setting a target based on absolute reductions needed versus what is cost effective. And if so, could you speak to that a bit more?
Yeah, thanks, Kara. Yes, we did build that in a little bit, partially because, and again, this came very much out of the energy efficiency, the community energy planning work that we had been doing, was precisely that we had municipalities who wanted to push the envelope further, and are clearly, and we generally interpret the people we've been dealing with as practice leaders in that space. And what they were running up against very consistently was the lack of data and the lack of modeling tools to enable them to do those kinds of things. And so one of the things we did build in the EEO mandate, this is all clearly completely hypothetical, but it was one of the areas in which we thought this agency could play a constructive role in helping with data access, especially perhaps with some of the modeling components too. We know in BC there's a climate toolkit online available for municipalities as well, to help them do this kind of thing. So this was one of the gaps we were thinking about, that we're clearly seeing municipalities thinking about how do we push the envelope in this space, and then seeing fairly direct expressions of the frustrations and sort of improvised, I think the word I've used is artisanal efforts to try and fill some of these gaps on a very individualized sort of basis. And so I think there could be some role for this agency in facilitating some of that data access. And then also, say we built in, drawing from what we knew in BC, something like the step code concept, that if municipalities want to push further here, that they would have the tools to do that. That this was intended to facilitate action at that level. It's again also part of the reason we wanted to bring the LDCs back into this conversation, because they're obvious potential allies in all of this. They also hold some of the data along with Enbridge. That if you're trying to do this kind of work at a local level, you definitely want them engaged in something more creative than just poles and wires activities. You want them thinking forward around this and around what they can do as well. So that was all part of our thinking about designing this, is how do you facilitate some of that local level activity as well as bringing about a higher degree of coordination at the provincial level. It's kind of an interesting experience in Quebec. We're only just beginning to see the bottom-up part happen, whereas in Ontario we've already got quite a lot of activity. We just and we're sort of more at the stage of, we're trying to do this and we can't find the necessary tools to make it work. Next question I've seen is from Kevin, and it is asking about the potential study. We looked at the various potential studies, and there's an earlier one as well, which was somewhat more optimistic. And at this stage, we sort of left that as there, as a, precisely it does suggest there's some substantial potential. We know there's been some debate about whether that study is too conservative, and whether more might be possible. And that again was part of the reason why we thought having a new agency with a mandate to sort of renew on the potential study work and to push the envelope on it would be very, very useful. So Navius is there, but we're trying to think, can we push further than that? So that's a starting point. We did not want to get into, for this particular study, we were very conscious of not trying to second guess other people's potential studies. That wasn't our focus or our specific expertise. We're fundamentally governance people more than anything else. And so that was the part we really wanted to focus on, other than that, yes, we know we've got potential studies out there which are saying there is a lot of space, and there is then argument about what the actual realizable potential might look like. Just looking at other questions here. Question from Nicole at Pembina, and then I'll come back to Ralph, because I'm getting some through the chat and some through the other mechanism, through the hand raise. From the LDCs, the short answer is partially. This has been an interesting set of conversations, and we were sort of aware that many of the LDCs are thinking about their future role and their role in facilitating distributed resource development, especially, and certainly a more active role than a sort of poles and wires kind of function. And so from that perspective, the response is we hadn't put the question to them quite as directly as that. But our thinking was certainly that some of them seem to show a much higher level of ambition in terms of what they could be doing. And in some ways, and certainly the conversations we've had about community energy planning, sort of very much suggests that the sort of DER and efficiency elements of those conversations are very, very closely tied together, and that the LDCs are potentially very significant actors in those processes, as is Enbridge. So our expectation is, and without being specific to anyone, we would expect there would be interest in a more engaged role around this, especially if the funding question can be resolved in some creative, either we could push beyond rate bases, that would obviously be very helpful too. But that's our sense, is that there is, at least among some of the LDCs, definitely an appetite to be more engaged than what they've been left with at the moment. I think there was a lot of unhappiness about the loss of capacity around doing efficiency activities, and I think an interest in broadening the portfolio of their activities again. So I would think there may be some potential there. Ralph has got some comments here as well. I'll leave those for now and see where we are in terms of hands. Which is that mostly our traffic is coming through yes, and this was again one of our questions to one of our drivers, was precisely the question. We flagged this, and we flagged this in other places, around the question of IESO's overall plan, that if we're that at the moment we've got a very strong emphasis, the strategy in the context of nuclear refurbishments and retirements seems to favor natural gas very, very strongly as the preferred generating option, and that has significant carbon implications. We certainly saw minimizing the role of gas as one of the goals that we would have around an efficiency strategy. There's a larger set of questions there too, in terms of optimizing, if we're in an electrification mode, that invites another set of questions around electricity supply that we don't at the moment have any particularly good structures for engaging in. There's a whole series of questions around the role of gas-fired generation versus renewables versus imports from Quebec versus distributed resource development, which at the moment we haven't really been able to figure. We don't really have a structure for getting at. And again, one of our goals here around giving Energy Efficiency Ontario a mandate to think about some of these things is it would provide a vehicle more focused on certainly maximizing the efficiency possibilities, but also beginning to think about particularly where distributed resources might fit into this conversation as well, and in some ways sort of forcing forward the conversation about larger supply questions. And at the moment, yeah, we're in a default that looks to gasify the system significantly and to erode a lot of the gains that were made through the coal phase out. And the question remains out there, which we don't seem to have any real mechanism to discuss, is do we have better alternatives we want to be thinking about before we lock into that pathway? Just looking at other questions here. Yeah, in terms of potential studies, yeah, our notion of a new agency is around integration and this question of how do you cross the gas and electricity divide. and coordinate what happens on both fronts, and especially at a consumer level, which both at a strategy level and a consumer level, actually, because we do have some examples of, as I mentioned, we have some at a sort of pilot level of mechanisms to coordinate the electricity and gas sides from a consumer perspective, but there are at a higher level some large trade-off questions that we need to be thinking through as well, especially around the future role of gas in the overall system, which because how you design your efficiency strategies is influenced by the consideration around the desire for a low carbon transition as well. And indeed, we had hints of that in the conversation around the Plan Directeur in Quebec, which admittedly never fully matured, partially because I think the conversation on the first pass was moving at a very high speed. But that's part of the rationale there too, is that if we're looking to optimize our strategy from a low carbon transitions perspective, that's where you're going to need the integration on the gas and electricity sides. And that's part of our rationale for thinking you need a new entity to do that. None of the existing organizations really have a mandate or sort of sense of legitimacy to engage in that level of conversation. Oops. Okay, I think, oops. I think we're getting through most of the questions. I'm just looking to see, people are using the chat more than hand raising, which is interesting because this is what happened with my class too, is we ended up resolving things through the chat function. Just going to follow up on some of the discussions here. Last one, I'm just seeing a few at the for those needing to raise hands, use the yes function if you can see it in the managed participant screen. Otherwise, just put it through into the chat. In terms of getting a new agency in place, this is from Judy Smith, clearly to make this work at the level that we were envisioning, this is going to require new legislation. That effectively you're going to be creating a new statutory corporation. Fundamentally, I mean, that was fundamentally the model in Quebec with TEC. There is legislation that creates the entity and also provides the core mandate in terms of what the agency is to do, and then establish the sort of pathway around the Plan Directeur. And that looks, that carried with it certain advantages, particularly around the ability to sort of marshal a variety of different agencies into the exercise, that there was a very clear and overriding statutory mandate at work on the part of TEC, that there was a need to respond and to present something to the Conseil des Ministres, to the cabinet, and once you had that, you sort of had a certain degree of lock-in through the cabinet approval of the things that the various agencies had committed to do through the Plan Directeur. So it does require new legislation. In terms of the political question, at this stage of the game, we are in a blank slate kind of circumstance. The province itself has sort of indicated to us here there is to be a conversation about where they go on conservation. So our attitude around that is that either if the current government wants to run with something like this, we'd be happy to see that. If future potential governments who may be starting to think about platforms going into 2022, which is now not so far off, want to pick up on and run with some of these ideas, that's fine as well. But we're kind of recognizing that there would have to be a decision at the political level to proceed down this kind of pathway as part of an overall low carbon transition strategy for the province. And that part I can't make happen other than and to say, that possibility needs to be out there. In Ontario, for a variety of reasons, these paths are ones that in our minds make, and many other people's minds, make a great deal of sense as a primary strategy. But we'll have to see what happens at the political level. We looked a little bit at Green On, but it again was only partially formed at the stage that it was executed, and so in some ways we tended to look more towards tech and some of the other agencies which were more clearly formed in terms of how they were going to proceed in terms of a model. And to say, with tech especially, the extent to which there was such a comprehensive mandate given, and that may be a very Quebec thing, seemed to us, though, to respond to what we were hearing, which is on the one hand, that the existing polycentricity of the system in Ontario was an asset, but that there were large gaps in terms of coordination and integration. And it seemed to us this was the only way you're ever going to be able to get at that set of problems. And from Franklin, good to hear from Franklin Gertler, who knows the Quebec side as well. Yes, we're kind of aware. I mean, with tech, we're sort of, some pieces are carried over significantly as well. We're kind of at a stage of looking at how far that we've got. I must admit, we've looked at it mostly from the viewpoint of the plan stage, and I agree that we're going to need to we're going to have to look at how far we've managed to push the envelope. And we know that with tech, there were significant debates around the level of ambition in the targets that were adopted, and whether they were pushing far enough, especially on the low carbon side. And that part, again, we would have to think through in Ontario. I think it becomes in part a function of how integrated what we're proposing to do becomes in a overall climate change strategy. But absolutely, there may be some weaknesses there, and we're sort of waiting to see some of the evaluation out of tech, assuming it continues to exist long enough for that to happen. And that, of course, raises a whole other set of resiliency questions, which we'll have to think about further down the road. So I'm just going to switch back and check for hands. Another question from Kevin. Again, just asking about political viability. And since we've sort of touched on this already, that I think we were really looking beyond the current mode of the Ford government in terms of thinking about sort of political appeal. And indeed, at this stage, we're in a very significant transitional moment for other reasons as well. So I'm in an I don't know mode at this stage in terms of whether the province itself is sort of having an epiphanal moment around recognizing the importance of the role of the provincial state in doing certain things, and how far that goes in changing the government's thinking about these kinds of things, we don't know. But we kind of decided in terms of strategy, we might as well go big as opposed to going home, and really sort of say, if we're really thinking about this in terms of the governance issues that we've identified, this looks like, rather than trying to make incremental adjustments to what has existed, which is largely what we've had so far, both the scale of the challenge around the low carbon transition and the sort of challenge of the polycentric nature of the system has been such that seemed, if we're serious, it made more sense to go down this path. As I say, it may be this government, it may be a future government that picks up on some of these themes, but that part we can't control. We're just in the business of knowledge generation and brokerage, and there's elements of both of those things here. And what people decide to do with what we've put on the table is to a certain degree up to them. All I can say is at least the initial responses we received from the province were ones of pleasantly surprising openness, and we'll see where that leads. Further questions? I thought, Kyra, you were trying to put your hand up, and I don't know if you were, if that was back a bit, or whether there's another question to go.
Nope, I was just technologically frustrated, but it's sorted out.
Okay, very good. Yeah, we're all in varying degrees of technological frustration through this. So I'm not seeing any further questions. So this may be a good place to wrap for now. I'm certainly going to go back and look through the Zoom, the chat conversation as well, and think about where we go from here. The reality is that limitations of time, we sort of realized in some ways what was the appendix to the main report should have been a standalone report on Ontario itself, in which we might have thought some of these things through further as well. But I'm going to have a look back at the chat conversation as well. I mean, we're sort of getting responses from governments as we're going as well. But I again want to thank everybody. This has been very useful. Words of wisdom from Ralph, as always, which we need to take into account as well. One last question, and I think we'll call it a wrap. And that's from Julia Zeman. Other funding mechanisms other than rate basing. This one we struggled with, and your only two other options left are it's either the tax base, which at least nominally the province said it's doing for electricity in Ontario, but of course it isn't. And that demonstrates precisely the vulnerability of that funding model, that it is just profoundly non-resilient, that for reasons completely unrelated to energy efficiency, you can see budgets cut simply because of deficit situations, desire to make tax cuts, all kinds of other political factors. So the only other, there have been variations, the other major possibilities that have emerged have been variations on the carbon pricing concept and variations on what's called sort of cap, trade, and invest type models. RGGI does a certain amount of this. The sort of northeastern state climate change emission trading strategy generates revenues, with some of which are made available for energy efficiency. And, in theory, there was to have been a large revenue stream in Ontario through the cap and trade system. That is fundamentally what propels the funding for tech's work in Quebec. So that is the other obvious possibility, would be to bring, if we can sort out the carbon pricing question, that's what could potentially realize a different revenue stream, which would be enormously helpful, because we are sensitive to the political challenges of putting things back on the rate base in Ontario. But at the moment, that does seem likely to need to be part of the whole conversation. Okay, I think that's probably a good place to wrap. As I say, I want to thank everybody for participating. Hopefully this was interesting and useful, a distraction from the places in which we find ourselves in the world. And all I can say is stay well and keep thinking forward. And thank you all very much. Thank you.